The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes 1892, Episode 4, The Boscombe Valley Mystery. Welcome back, fellow detectives. After witnessing the cruel deception of the identity case, you might think family betrayals can't get any darker. But today's mystery will show you that sometimes the sins of the past can destroy the innocent in the present. Have you ever wondered how a single moment of violence can echo through generations, creating a web of guilt, fear, and false accusations? Prepare yourself for a case where nothing is as it appears, and where clearing one man's name means exposing secrets that have been buried for decades. Picture yourself on a gray October morning in 1889, when Inspector Lestrade himself arrives at 221B Baker Street with urgent news from Herefordshire. His usually confident demeanor shows cracks of uncertainty as he explains. "Holmes, we have what appears to be an open and shut murder case, but something about it troubles me deeply. I'd value your opinion before we proceed to trial." The case seems straightforward enough. Charles McCarthy, a wealthy landowner, has been found dead beside Boscombe Pool, with his skull crushed by a blunt instrument. His own son James was seen arguing violently with him just minutes before the murder, and the young man's story is so full of contradictions that even his own lawyer doubts his innocence. But notice how Holmes listens with growing interest, rather than dismissing this as a simple domestic killing. What might be alerting his detective instincts that all is not as it seems? Think about it. If a case appears so obviously solved, why would Scotland Yard's most experienced inspector feel uncertain enough to seek outside help? Lestrade continues with the damning evidence. James McCarthy admits to following his father to their regular meeting place by Boscombe Pool, admits to arguing with him loudly enough for witnesses to hear, and was found standing over the body covered in blood. He claims someone else killed his father, but can provide no proof whatsoever. What does the young man say happened during this argument? Holmes inquires, already sensing inconsistencies in what should be a simple case. Lestrade shakes his head. That's where his story becomes completely unbelievable. He claims his father was calling out to someone named Cooee just before the attack, but no one else heard this mysterious cry. Here's your first puzzle to consider, detective. Why would a dying man call out such an unusual word? Cooee isn't a typical English exclamation. Could this strange detail actually be a crucial clue rather than a desperate lie from a guilty son? The evidence against James McCarthy seems overwhelming. The groundskeeper William Crowder saw both men walking toward Boscombe Pool, heard their violent argument, and discovered James standing over his father's body. The local doctor confirmed that Charles McCarthy died from a savage blow to the head with some heavy, blunt instrument. But Holmes notices something that troubles him immediately. Lestrade, you mentioned that James was covered in blood when found. Was this his father's blood? When Lestrade confirms it was, Holmes presses further. Yet you also say the murder weapon was never found. How does a man commit such a violent murder, get covered in blood, yet manage to dispose of the weapon so completely that your entire team cannot locate it? Think about this logical problem, detective. If James McCarthy had just killed his father in a frenzy, would he have had the presence of mind to hide the weapon perfectly while leaving himself covered in incriminating blood? What does this contradiction suggest about the real sequence of events? Holmes decides to examine the scene personally, and soon you find yourself traveling through the beautiful Herefordshire countryside to the McCarthy estate at Boscombe Valley. The setting is peaceful, rolling green hills, a pristine lake, and wealthy farms. But beneath this tranquil surface, you sense dark currents of old secrets and hidden guilt. Your first stop is to interview James McCarthy himself in the local jail. The young man is clearly devastated by his father's death and terrified by his position. But notice how his story remains consistent despite intensive questioning. He maintains that he followed his father to their usual meeting spot after receiving a note asking him to come to Boscombe Pool. "I found my father already there, but he seemed to be waiting for someone else," James explains. "When he saw me, he became angry, saying I shouldn't have come. We argued because he wanted me to marry Alice Turner, old Turner's daughter, and I refused because my heart belongs to someone else entirely." Here's a crucial detail that everyone else has overlooked. James says his father was expecting someone else at that meeting. If this is true, it means Charles McCarthy had arranged to meet another person entirely, not his son. Could this mysterious third party be the real killer? During our argument, I heard my father cry out "Cooee" twice, James continues earnestly. I turned to see what he was looking at, and when I looked back, he was falling to the ground with blood streaming from his head. I caught him as he fell, which is how I got covered in blood, but I never struck him. Holmes studies the young man carefully, watching for signs of deception, but finds only genuine grief and bewilderment. James, think carefully about your father's final word. You're certain he said "Cooee" and not something else? When James nods firmly, Holmes makes a note that clearly has significance beyond what anyone else understands. Next, you visit the crime scene itself, a secluded spot beside the peaceful Boscombe pool where father and son had met regularly for years. Holmes examines every inch of ground with his magnifying glass, paying particular attention to footprint impressions in the soft earth near the water's edge. Fascinating, Holmes murmurs, studying the ground intently. Watson, detective friend, look at these footprints carefully. How many different sets do you see? When you examine the area, you can clearly distinguish 3 separate sets of footprints, 2 you'd expect from father and son, but a third set that belongs to neither of them. But Holmes discovers something even more significant. Look at this third set of prints. They show someone with a pronounced limp in the left leg. See how the left footprint is shallower and the stride uneven? Our mysterious third person has a distinctive physical characteristic that should make identification possible. The investigation takes a dramatic turn when Holmes examines the surrounding woodland and finds something everyone else missed: a piece of gray cloth caught on a bramble bush about 50 yards from the scene. But more importantly, he discovers clear evidence that someone had been hiding in the woods, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. This was no crime of sudden passion, Holmes explains to you and Watson. Someone planned this carefully, knew about the father and son's regular meetings, and waited in concealment for the perfect opportunity. James McCarthy didn't kill his father. He interrupted someone else's carefully planned murder. The case takes another surprising turn when Holmes interviews Alice Turner, the young woman James's father wanted him to marry. She reveals a shocking piece of information that changes everything. Mr. Holmes, I must tell you something in complete confidence. My father and Charles McCarthy weren't just neighbors. They had some kind of shared past that they never discussed with anyone. Both men came to Australia roughly 30 years ago as young men seeking their fortunes. When they returned to England, they were wealthy enough to buy adjacent estates, but there was always tension between them. I often caught them having intense, whispered conversations that stopped whenever anyone approached. Think about this revelation, detective. 2 men with mysterious shared history, sudden wealth acquired in Australia decades ago, and ongoing secretive tensions. What kind of past might create such a relationship? What could they have done in Australia that would bind them together yet keep them in conflict? Holmes's investigation into the 2 men's Australian past reveals the stunning truth. Through careful research of old newspaper archives and shipping records, he discovers that Charles McCarthy and John Turner were both involved in a notorious gold robbery in Ballarat during the 1850s, where they killed a security guard during their escape. They were partners in crime 30 years ago, Holmes explains, but something happened that created lasting animosity between them. My theory is that Turner eventually felt guilt about their crimes, while McCarthy remained unrepentant and possibly used their shared secret to blackmail Turner over the years. The final piece of the puzzle falls into place when Holmes discovers John Turner's current condition. The man is dying of diabetes and has developed a severe limp from complications of his disease. Turner fits perfectly with the physical evidence found at the crime scene, and his deteriorating health would explain his decision to finally confront his old partner. Holmes arranges a private meeting with John Turner at his estate, and the dying man's confession reveals the full truth. McCarthy had been blackmailing me for years, threatening to expose our past crimes unless I continued paying him substantial sums. When he demanded that I force my daughter to marry his son to cement our financial arrangement permanently, I knew I had to end it. I arranged to meet him at Boscombe Pool that morning to tell him the blackmail was finished. Turner continues with obvious relief at finally unburdening himself. When he laughed and said he'd destroy my daughter's reputation by exposing our crimes, something snapped inside me. I struck him with my walking stick before I even realized what I was doing. The tragic irony becomes clear. Turner killed McCarthy to protect his daughter's future. But in doing so, he nearly destroyed an innocent young man who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. James McCarthy's refusal to marry Alice Turner, which had angered his father so much, was actually motivated by his desire to protect her from a loveless marriage. Holmes faces a moral dilemma that tests his principles. John Turner is clearly guilty of murder, but he's also a dying man who acted to protect his daughter from a lifetime of blackmail and shame. Meanwhile, James McCarthy faces execution for a crime he didn't commit. "Mr. Turner," Holmes says finally, "I cannot allow an innocent man to hang for your crime. However, I also recognize that justice is not always served by the courts. I propose a solution that serves both truth and mercy." Holmes arranges for Turner to provide a written confession that will clear James McCarthy, but agrees to hold it secretly until Turner's natural death, which his doctors predict will come within months. This allows Turner to spend his final days with his daughter while ensuring that justice ultimately prevails. True to Holmes's prediction, John Turner dies peacefully in his sleep just 3 months later. His confession clears James McCarthy completely and reveals the complex web of guilt, blackmail, and desperation that led to Charles McCarthy's death. The case concludes with James McCarthy's freedom and his engagement to Alice Turner, who chooses to honor her father's memory while building a future free from the shadows of his past crimes. Sometimes love can indeed grow from the ashes of tragedy. So tell me, detective, did you suspect John Turner before Holmes revealed the truth? What clues pointed to his guilt rather than James's? And most importantly, what does this complex case teach us about how past sins can poison the present, and how justice must sometimes be tempered with mercy? This mystery reminds us that the truth is often hidden beneath layers of secrets, guilt, and false assumptions. Sometimes the most obvious suspect is innocent, while the real killer hides behind a mask of respectability and approaching death. Join me next time as we investigate the 5 Orange Pips, a case where mysterious symbols and ancient vengeance reach across oceans to claim new victims in Victorian London.